Welcome back, everyone, to Remember What's Next. Rabbi Ken Spiro from Israel. Thank you for joining us, as always.
Always good to be here. Happy New Year.
Yeah, Shana Tova. We are beginning a new year and a new season. We've decided to finally flip the switch to go to season four. We've got quite a few episodes in our season three, so we decided it's time to shift. We're going to begin this season, not necessarily thematically, but to begin it with a delving into what is a deeper idea in terms of Jewish history? What is it that's going on? And when you're in the middle, literally in the middle of historical events, which we are right now as Jews, how come it doesn't feel that way? And like, how do we hold what's happening now without just simply being terrified 24/7? Like, how do we go forward from here?
Yeah, so I think at the beginning of a new year, when we've had such a rough previous year, literally, it corresponded almost exactly to the beginning of the last Jewish year, 5784. We're now in 5785, which just by itself is an amazing thought. That how long we have been around and how we have been recording history from the very beginning. There's an interesting quote uh, that Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, who was a historian, I believe at Columbia University, no longer with us, he wrote a book called Zachor, which means memory. And he had an interesting quote. He said that Herodotus, who was a Greek who wrote 2,500 years ago, and he was talking about the Greek-Persian Wars. He said Herodotus is the first person in the West to record history. We always assume that people recorded history, but the Jews are the first people to understand that history has meaning, that it's not just recording the events, it's seeing the plot in the story. That's why I always jokingly, half jokingly, but actually seriously say that's why it's called his story. There's an
Right.
idea of determinism that in the ancient world, people believed that you were in a world that was also occupied by a bunch of gods who cynically used and abused you in their own machinations and plots because they couldn't kill each other because they're immortal, but they could certainly take out vengeance on the puppets below. And not only that, the story never ends. The notion of even time having a beginning it only comes out with Albert Einstein in the 20th century. Even people like Sir Isaac Newton believed that it always existed. So
Mhm.
that we're in a story that has a beginning and an end, and there's a plot to the story is extremely transformative because otherwise, and you could see that today. You could walk around with the same feeling today. If you believe that your things are out of control, your decisions really don't matter, and the story doesn't end, it's kind of unempowering and depressing. And Judaism introduced a tremendous amount of optimism into this whole narrative that there's a producer director, the big guy upstairs, and he's actively involved in his creation. He didn't just create the world and then go on vacation. And unlike a Hollywood movie where the actors might look like they're really feeling stuff and really doing stuff, but they're only acting and it's special effects and whatever, um, we get to interact. It's like an interesting kind of theater production where the actors get to interact with the producer and director and decide how the scenes unfold. We know there's a definitive end and it has to end a certain way, but it can go many different ways. There are many different variations in that. And
I
also in
think
that
that's,
idea,
I
yeah,
think just to throw in, because it makes me realize, we do take for granted this idea of history, meaning it seems like what you're saying is prior to Judaism's introduction of a narrative that says history is a story that's moving throughout an arc of history that will take us from here to here. That before that, it was just simply one day, well, it's just one foot in front of the other. And
yeah,
if you're living a life where it's just one foot in front of the other, which look, and you could look at different Eastern religions and saying, okay, that's just being present, right? You don't worry about the past, you don't worry about the future, you just be in the present. But that means that idea means history doesn't matter and the future doesn't matter because you don't play a part in either of those things. And it's really interesting to see, oh, we've been brought up in that idea that history matters, that building our future is in our hands. But I think what you're saying is it wasn't always like that, that humanity didn't think of history, like either the past or the future, as something that we even had a hand in, or that we could contribute to, or that we could make decisions towards. Are we going in the right direction? Just asking that question itself is a new thing that was new, put in quotes, introduced by the narrative of the Torah. So am I getting that right?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. It's that I'm part of a story. Jews are unique in this way. It says in the book of Deuteronomy we just read, it says, Zachor Yemot Olam, remember the days of the world. It says, ask your father and he'll tell you, the elders, and we have this idea that you can't know where you're going to until you understand where you're coming from. And that is all predicated on the notion of create intelligent creation, which has with a meaning. Otherwise, it would just randomly popped out of, random genetic evolution with no guided process. It's all, be Epicurean, just have a good time because it doesn't really make a difference and you're going to be gone. So it's a completely different, it's in many ways very empowering and very positive. It's nothing like being, you could say the Zen thing is like this, the journey, you're always focused on the destination. Of course, we're also Jews are very into being present too. But it's also gives a sense of meaning and responsibility that otherwise you really don't have. And whereas some ancient people may have recorded events for the sake of recording events, for aggrandizing the king and for the glory, and it wasn't ever viewed as, uh, you know, giving people a sense of meaning and purpose. That wasn't it. It was just had another, the notion, like you said correctly, that first of all, the whole idea of objective recording of history, and we could argue that there's no real objective recording of history. There's a
Right.
great line, not even God can change history, only historians can. I mean, I always jokingly say I'm the only historian whose personal opinions never enter into anything unless it's talking about the United Nations. But but
Right,
seriously,
right. And look, if there
it's
are
a
any
completely,
people who in any way believe or support Israel, but thought, no, no, like history is just facts, it's not messed with, it's, there's some kind of objective history. All you have to do is look at the narratives that are being put out there right now about what's happened in Israel to realize no, people are rewriting history on a regular basis, and it affects people's behaviors and choices and decisions, and now political policy as well. So we're really getting it in our face that history is actually quite fragile.
100% and everyone should go back and read, even though it's now a book that's dated from decades ago, but read 1984, George Orwell, one of the great anti-utopian novels of the 20th century, where he talks exactly about, I mean, this is a whole separate topic about, especially with the internet, what is truth? Who is vetting anything? That's a whole topic about how do you know what's even right or wrong or true in an absolute sense anymore. And now with deep fakes, it's getting scarier. It's going to be harder and harder to discern reality from fantasy. But another really interesting side of this idea of a producer director is that there are patterns in the story. There are rules to the game. I apologize for outside my window, living in the middle of downtown Jerusalem. Every siren goes by my house.
No worries.
Yeah. Hey, it's always exciting in the Middle East. But that there are actually patterns and rules to the game, which is also extremely important. We even before, like, we studied physics. I always, when I'm teaching students, I say, you may have studied physics in 12th grade. I'm demonstrating here gravity, even before you studied the, Newtonian laws of physics, when you're in 12th grade, you actually learned the principles of gravity, maybe without the terminology as you grew up. You tried to stand up and fell down. You dropped food off the high chair. But because at a very young age, you learned that, you knew there was an immediate, always cause and effect, which is, of course, extremely important, because if there was no laws to nature, I always say, imagine if you walked outside your house and every day you randomly flew in a different direction because there was no constant law of gravity holding you down. None of us would live very long in this world.
Right.
So when it comes to science, we say, yeah, there's rules. It's amazing. Like, oops, that's really interesting. There's law and there's order. Order implies someone ordering it. Think about it. But I say the same infinite intelligence that put laws into scientific principles, that infinite put rules into history. There's a playbook. And that same infinite intelligence that did that also, he has a list of, so to speak, cast of characters in his story, as all movies do. There's the lead actors, the supporting actors, there's the bit parts, there's the walk-ons. And because of stuff we've talked about before in other seasons, we understand that, our role in the story of the Jewish people is we are kind of a plot rewrite in terms of the original narrative. It's a fundamental point to understand what the bottom line plot. Strip away all the little details, like see the forest through the trees. We understand the original plot is, if an infinite creator of the universe who needs nothing from us creates a world to give us a relationship with him. We say it's about pleasure. Interesting concept that we could talk about a long time, but the greatest pleasure that we can have in this world is experiencing direct connection with the infinite light, so to speak. And the initial idea of creation was just this Garden of Eden thing where we have everything taken care of so we could focus all of our time and all of our attention on experiencing God. Why have lower level pleasures like eating ice cream when you can have the ultimate transcendence, the light that everyone sees when they have the near-death experiences, which everyone describes as an overwhelming feeling of love. And except like it's like having 1,000 mothers loving you at once, or an infinite number, and wives and girlfriends and boy. It's like whatever.
Right.
Um, so but humanity blew that, and like I said, all of human, we had humanity degenerates, the relationship with God is lost. We have the flood story, God tries with Noah, that doesn't work, and just when it seems all is lost because humanity doesn't seem to be able to stick to the plot. Along comes Abraham and chooses for himself and for us this unique responsibility. So there's like a plot rewrite, which happens in movies sometimes. The director doesn't like how this scene worked or that ending is. He pulls the release date, reshoots it. So the point being is, Ellie, that we know what the end game is, but how quickly, how slowly, how painfully, how painlessly that happens is the fantastic interplay between humanity as a whole and the big guy producer director upstairs. And where we, the Jewish people, fit into the story is that Abraham chooses for himself a very unique responsibility that he's able to, in a world that's all worshiping idols and is totally lost the plot, literally. He chooses to reconnect to a counterintuitive, unbelievable, infinite, invisible being, God, who has an absolute standard of morality and truth, and he dedicates himself to this unique mission, which all Jews, we should focus on this. We do say this every day, by the way. We say in the morning prayers, Ashreinu matov halkenu, how happy are we, how good is our lot. That when all the smoke clears, we have to recognize that Abraham chose for himself and for his descendants, us, the Jewish people, going 3,700 years in the future. We're talking about only one job in this world, which now casts us in the role of the lead actors, despite our teeny size. Like the movie, the lead actors are always the fewest actors anyway. The bit parts and the walk-ons are most of the people in a movie. But to be the people whose job it is to reconnect humanity to relationship with God. That's what we're chosen for, this unique responsibility. And once we understand that, that's like a game changer. It's like someone telling you in a movie, but not telling you what the movie's about, what your role is, and not giving you a script. You got it. So it's so incredibly important. But so the producer director says to Abraham, so to speak, you choosing me, Abraham, I choose you back for this unique responsibility. And because it's a long movie, it's even longer than the last book of Harry Potter there. They made 2 movies out of the last one, and the book was really big. But you will get to the end. I can promise you get there. I kind of like the movie that best illustrates that is The Hunger Games. That these people are narrating through this scenario, and everything is real for them. They can actually get killed, but like the guys in the control room can throw all kinds of things in there, like really scary beasts that can eat you.
Yeah.
So it's this amazing interplay but again, there's rules. There's rules. The creator, he gives us a guidebook and he says, you do X, Y will happen. There's patterns, which is like the science. We're talking about gravity, which is super empowering. Otherwise, like what? I don't know what's going to be. No, we do know what's going to be. And when we pull back and look at those patterns, then we see that it's like, the scientific theory, you have the empirical method, you have hypotheses, experimentation, observation. You can take certain like themes in human history and specifically in Jewish history, And you can see that over and over again. We do X,
Okay.
Y
So
happens.
let's
X
so let's get
happens.
an example. Like what are some of the rules? What are some of the patterns? And where do we think we are in one of those loops? Like how do we contextualize this for where we are today?
So by far, the number one is because Abraham chose God and God chose Abraham, and we took upon ourselves the ultimate mission, almost impossible. And because we are, so to speak, the God squad, we are promised. And again, where do you see the rules? The rules are all laid out in the Bible, which is not a law book. It's not a culture book. It's not a history book. It may contain references to law, references to culture, references to history, but it's hashkafa. It's the worldview book. It's the playbook of how the game works. And just to throw in one more little piece of information, a great medieval commentator named Nachmanides, the Ramban, who lived in Spain in the 13th century, he says Maseh avot siman labanim, that the actions of the fathers are assigned to the children, that which happens in the beginning of the story is kind of the revealed pattern of everything that's going to come out later. And if you look at one of the most oft repeated themes that the producer director upstairs says to Abraham, is that, he promises us he'll give us a land, but he basically says there'll always be a Jewish people. Why? Because we chose a unique responsibility. It comes with a certain reward, but because our role in history is now so central, humanity cannot achieve its goal if we ever disappear. And the survival of the Jewish people, despite all the other supernatural weird things, many of them which are negative, it's like crazy. It's the most bipolar history in the world, the ups and downs of who we are. But the fact that you and I are having this conversation and that you're sitting in Toronto and I'm sitting in Jerusalem, 3,700 years after Abraham chose for himself and for us this responsibility is mind-blowing.
Yeah.
And there's no natural explanation for us being here. But one of the other problems with being Jewish is, besides you have a mother who wants you to be a doctor or a lawyer and all the guilt you have to feel and whatever, is that so much weird stuff has happened to us that if weird and supernatural happens to you on a daily basis, it just becomes normal and natural. And so we don't see it. Like we're in the middle. Not only are we not seeing how the events, because we're so in the middle, especially now of all these intense things going on and the world's going crazy and everyone's condemning us and Iran's trying to go nuclear. It may already be nuclear, by the way. There's a lot of speculation. They're detecting seismic activity in the area of Tehran. We're not pulling out and seeing the plot, and we're not pulling out and seeing how amazing it is that we're here. And that's very empowering, because just to know that we're guaranteed to survive is great. The problem is we're guaranteed to survive as a whole. Who survives is a different story. It's like telling a guy, you're going to be alive at the end, but you might be missing your arms and your legs. So we can't be complacent about it. But the point is, we don't necessarily see it, which is why whenever I'm quoting people, I love, collecting great quotes about what people say about Jews. It's always best to quote non-Jews, and a lot of famous non-Jews have constantly pointed this out. And when Jews say things about Jews, myself included, no one believes Rabbi Spiro. What's he say? You can't believe him. He's biased. But when non-Jews say it, so that's why I just want to read you one great quote. This is Alexander Hamilton. Okay, we all know Alexander Hamilton. He's got a musical named after him. But look at this quote. It's so great. This is from, he died in 1804. Progress of the Jews from their earliest history to the present time has been and is entirely out of the ordinary course of human affairs. Boom. Perfect. Is it not a fair conclusion that the cause also is an extraordinary one? In other words, that this is the effect of some great providential plan. Wow. That's two sentences that perfectly hit it. That anyone looking at the highs and the lows, just the survival of the Jewish people, which is predicted more than almost any other prediction in the Bible, that we are still here today, having outlasted so many civilizations and empires, a lot of whom, by the way, have tried to destroy us,
Right.
is one of the most empowering things to recognize. You mess with the Jews, you lose. Mark Twain, the famous American author, from the late 19th, early 20th century. He said the Egyptian, the Babylonian, the Persian rose, filled the planet with sound and splendor, and faded to dream stuff and passed away. The Greek and Roman followed and made a vast noise, and they're gone. Other peoples have held their torch high for a time, but they sit in twilight now or have vanished. The Jews saw them all, beat them all. He says all things are mortal, but the Jew, all our forces pass, but he remains. What is the secret of his immortality? I've said that quote so many times, it's actually embedded in my brain, in my memory.
Right. Right.
But he sees it. He sees it, and a lot of, by the way, our supporters in the world today see that.
But I guess part of the challenge is, and maybe this is like you said, missing the forest for the trees, or look, living in North America as a Jew, just especially in this generation where like the supernatural, never mind the religious, seems, any talk of that feels very woo-woo, and you're not quite sure how to relate to it. Like, again, I think it's that piece of when you're in events in history, you don't recognize you're in the events of history. And it doesn't seem unusual. I got up this morning, I made a coffee, I did my workout, like your daily life is still day to day, but then you're looking at the news and being really scared and really terrified. And the idea that, yes, like we will be here no matter what, feels like fantastical thinking. So like, how do we do that? Because I agree with you, there's patterns that we can look to, but it doesn't feel like we're in a pattern, and it's very hard to hold that context.
Yeah. So first of all, you brought up a very good point, that the whole idea, we live in a very kind of rational world, and we think of Bible stories as, a lot of people are like, yes, primitive people, they didn't understand science and cause and effect. And Purim is the story that everyone needs to study, one of the two rabbinic holidays, meaning it's not mentioned in the 5 books of Moses. And it's the only Jewish holiday that happens in diaspora, when we're in exile in the Persian Empire. But Purim tells you how the world will work until the present. That look in the Bible, seas split and plagues destroy empires. We don't get that anymore in the same, it's actually, Purim is one of the 2 books of the Bible where God's name isn't mentioned, that and the Song of Songs.
Right.
But in the end, when everyone looked at the story, and it's like a micro version of history, when everyone looked back on how seemingly we're on the verge of destruction and everything flipped over, that they were kiblu v'kimu, they accepted and they established that this is the hand of God. His name, his open presence isn't there, but boy, do we see his fingerprints everywhere.
Right.
And
That's interesting.
that's the point. You're right. What you're talking about is 100%. When you're just when we are, as an individual person, most of us are not involved in the like, just as most people in human history don't make decisions that change the course of human history. Most of us live relatively small lives.
Right.
But we have to look at the collective. That's why it's saying we got to look past our own. When I say the forest through the trees, it's not just the events. It's me versus us. It's the world. And when you do that, then you see that there's an incredible number of events in modern history that we've seen in the last year, by the way, that have every one of them has a logical explanation. It didn't involve the suspensions of the laws of nature.
Mm-hmm.
Israel trashing 3 Arab armies in 6 days, tripling its territory and getting control of Jerusalem for the first time in 2,000 years. Okay, I can explain every event, how it happened. None of it involved like planes falling from the sky or the ground opening up and swallowing the Egyptian army.
Right.
But it was pretty unbelievable. Us being hit in the last like half a year, well, first in April, by 350 cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and basically no damage. And then we had literally just like a few days ago, 180 ballistic missiles launched at Israel, and the only person killed was a Palestinian in Jericho hit by a falling missile. Now you could say, it's Israel's anti, but this is exactly the point.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there's just largely a bit of denial on all of our parts, because it's really true. Like if we weren't talking about Israel, if we were talking about any other country in the world, and there were 4 countries surrounding it, consistently lobbing ballistic missiles at the center of that country, and not one of and very minimal damage and almost no one killed, it would be like, what? Like, even with Iron Dome, even with like, you would still be like, what is going on here? Like, that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But I think, again, because it's Israel, because there's a certain double standard, a certain way of like, oh, but that's just different and it's always been different. We don't think about like that's radically outside the norm of how the world works.
Yeah, but but again, and we attribute it to like the Mossad and Jewish ingenuity, but it's so much more than that. And a lot of people, the danger is not that, think it's happenstance or to think that, oh, look what we did. It's a combination. It's not that we did stuff. It's not we sit back. By the way, one of the things we learned from how things work in this world, God, we always say, is an amazing coach. A coach doesn't want 100% results. He does want 100% effort. So like I said, it's an interplay between what we do and what God does. If the Mossad hadn't been successful, who knows? We could have gone through much more painful experiences the last two times. Or if the Iron Dome and David's sling hadn't worked as well, we'll get there. It could have been a much more painful experience for us. So it's not a zero-sum game of all God, all mankind. It's God says, you do your part down here, I'm turning it up there. And if you do the right things down here, then things will go a lot smoother and a lot better for you.
Right, which
And
fits with what you were saying about the Purim story, which is, Mordecai says to Esther, like, if not for, who knows, if not for this, that you were put into the palace to be able to, like, Esther does her part, Mordecai does his part, everybody does their part. They don't just say hands off, leave it to God. Everybody has to do their part. And I think that's part of the experience now, I would say, for Jews world and our allies worldwide, is like, what is my part and how do I figure that out and how do I get it done to the best of my ability? Because we're not supposed to just leave it up to God, but it sounds like what you're saying is we can't forget that God's part of the plan either.
Right. And we always say now that, by the way, you're quoting the Purim story, is exactly that Mordecai says to Esther, who's like, it's another great story. What's the chance of this Jewish girl ending up as married to the emperor of Persia? So he says to her, salvation will come to the Jews from another direction, but first of all, you blew your opportunity. You'll be lost. You'll probably not survive. The Jews will be saved a different way. And even if it's through salvation or through persecution, if we have to get a heavy message, if it doesn't come from this country or that person, from Iran or from the Nazi Germany, someone else would have used their free will to do what needed to be done to get the message that we needed to have. Because that's a super fundamental point we have to understand in the story. Judaism does not believe that good comes from God and bad comes from the devil. We believe that God is infinite, he knows and controls everything, and that everything happens in this world, whether it's good or it's bad, to the world in general, to Jewish people specifically, is all part of a plan. And we don't see exactly how it all fits in because we don't have the big picture, and we only see the here and now in the physical world. And not to go into the whole thing on, the other reality and the nature of the immortality of the soul and transmigrations of souls and reincarnation, all this stuff we can't begin to touch on. But just where we are in the here and now, it's so important to remember that, if there is someone running the show and he's the ultimate coach, producer, and director, he wants me to do whatever I can do. And the best story for that, by the way, is Jacob's reunification with Esau, his twin brother that he separated from for 22 years because his brother wanted to kill him, and he flees to Haran in Turkey to go to hang out with, Uncle Lavan and then marry Rachel and Leah. But when he goes the night before he meets Esav, he follows the famous three-pronged strategy. And this is such a great lesson for all of us. This is a lesson for nations. It's a lesson for the Jewish people individually, for each and every one of us. First of all, he pursues diplomatic initiative, and he prepares to fight, because you got to do both. Okay, you got to do the maximum you can in the physical world. You want to, as the Romans would say, sivi pacem pare bellum. If you want peace, prepare for war, but definitely pursue diplomatic initiative. And then he prays, because you got to recognize that I can make all the efforts in the world. With God's help, everything is possible. Without it, nothing is doable. And God looking at us saying, if you've done everything you can do, then sit back and I'll take care of the rest for you. But everything that we can do is predicated on the fact that we are connected to the rule book and we know what we're supposed to be doing. We know what our mission is in this world, and we know the playbook of how the game works. I
Okay, so
always say you
outline
can't
some of the
represent
rules
the
for
Jewish
us.
people.
What are some of the rules? How does this work?
Right. So first of all, like that big rule we said, there'll always be a Jewish people. Yes. That people, another huge rule is that people who are good to us will do well, and people who are bad to us will suffer. By the way, sometimes the people who start out being the best to us end up being the worst to us. Because another rule of the game, which is so vital now that we have a Jewish state reborn after 2,000 years of exile, we have to, again, it's amazing that 120 years ago, a half of 1% of the Jews in the world lived in Israel. Today, at least 50% of the Jews in the world are living in Israel. Is that, and this is the other super oft repeated idea in the Bible, God says, to your seed, I will give this land. That the only soil that we could plant the roots of the Jewish people in that will fully blossom and bloom is we are a nation. We're also a faith. We're a national faith. We're a culture. We're a people. We're a religion. But the only soil that we grow properly and the only place we can individually and collectively achieve our unique mission, which is to be this nation that's a light to nations, to be a nation in our national homeland, which means totally supernatural that we will come back after multiple exiles and dispersion, which is unique in human history. You look at all the empires that have been destroyed and disappeared, and nations and peoples who are gone, almost none of them are left. We're still here.
Yeah, this is where we say that, the creation of the state of Israel is the greatest act of decolonization in history, where an ancient ancestral people return to their homeland and actually create a viable democratic state that's based on values and freedoms. It's astonishing. It's also a thing that I think we don't often wrap our heads around.
Right, exactly. That like this, I've seen many people quoting this, that the Jewish people, the only people that they know of for thousands of years that is back living in the same land with the same faith, with the same capital city, with the same language. I mean, it's really, really unbelievable. But there's another side to that, another huge rule we have to appreciate, that punishment for not, and it says this right in the second paragraph of the Shema that we say we pray in the morning and at night, V'hoya im shamoa tishmu, if you will listen, God says, follow the playbook, have a good relationship with me and each other. You will live in peace in the land, and the land will prosper, and the crops will grow, and the nations will leave you alone. But if you don't, the two most classic signs of God's displeasure are drought, which now, due to modern technology, even Israel today with desalination has kind of eliminated that threat. But the huge one that is totally related to us today is exile. If the land of Israel is the ultimate reward, the unique spiritual location we can individually come into and live in and prosper in and elevate ourselves in the world by being the nation that's a light to nations, then being thrown out of that land is a punishment. And on a certain level, it's a desecration of God's name. It's like when God wants to wipe the Jewish people out any number of times in the wilderness. Moses is like talks them out of it, so to speak. What, you brought them? What will the nations of the world say? You brought them out of Egypt so you could slaughter them in the desert? But what does that mean? Here's a great rule, Ellie, such a huge rule for everyone listening who's not living in the land of Israel. There are only two kinds of Jews in this world, those who live in Israel and those who will be living in Israel. Now, 1,000 years ago, Jews were already 1,000 years in exile, another 1,000 years to come back. When we're this late in the story, there is no long-term future. And we see the pattern over and over again. Jews come into a place, they prosper, they get comfortable. By all normal laws of history, they should disappear and assimilate within the larger mass of people amongst whom they live. But precisely when they get too comfortable, like in Egypt, where the rabbis tell us the only thing that separated the Jews from the Egyptians after, a century of living there, like Jews coming into America in 1882 to 1920, fast forward 100 years later, they kept their language, they kept their names, and they kept their unique style of dress, which is more than a lot of Jews have today. And then boom, genocidal anti-Semitism comes from Pharaoh. And you see this in Germany. No one was more Jewish than German Jews. And now you see, look what's going on now as we're so close to the end of the story with the explosions of anti-Semitism in the world. It is really clear, since God told us you're always going to survive, and the end game for the Jewish people is messianic redemption, which is pretty much physical return to the land, spiritual return to Judaism. Think about it, 100 years ago, intermarriage jumped in America from 100 years ago from being a relatively small number, less than 10%, to now over 70%. But that's a normal pattern. And then you have, boom, a Baal Tshuva movement appears that Jews are returning en masse. A very significant percentage of Orthodox Jewish world are either themselves people who've chosen to return to observance, orthodoxy, or the children of such people. God, it says it's predicted. Here's the rule book. You have a mission. You can't escape it. To do that, you have to be in Israel. To do that, you have to know the system, which means you have to be connected to the Torah, which means one way or another, you will end up back here. And if you don't willingly come, when I gave you a nation in 1948, when it wasn't so easy to come, now it's actually a lot easier. Precisely in places where you're so comfortable that we've seen over and over again, literally for over 3,000 years, you're going to get it. And we see the level since October 7th of last year, the explosion of anti-Semitism in the world is mind-blowing. In 1989, 1990, when the Soviet Union collapsed, when what contained the second largest Jewish community in the world at the time, boom, 1 million of these people came to Israel within a couple of years. Wow. Like 20% of the population of Israel is like Russian speaking still today. That's why I learned Russian for 7 years. I can talk to people if I don't remember my Hebrew. But I'm saying this is, again, these are all rules and they're happening. And again, it's not like a voice coming from heaven saying, let my people go, or, get on El Al flight, a voice from heaven. But this is how through seemingly natural historical events and the patterns that's going on, we're coming home and we're returning to Judaism. It doesn't mean, look, we have a lot of work to do. We're still losing, we're hemorrhaging Jews at a phenomenally scary rate. But
I think I guess one of the things that it rubs against also a fundamental piece of Jewish personality, which is none of us like to be told what to do. And I think that part of the challenge is like whenever because it can sometimes sound like, if you don't become religious, you're going to suffer. Or if you don't move back to Israel, you're make Aliyah, you're going to suffer. And there's a piece of that just rubs against the desire to uphold the value of free will and free choice, to be able to, I think we have it's like, it can, like, so what does that mean? Everybody has to put on a black hat, grow payas, cover their hair, and move to Mea Sharim? Like, is that what we're telling people? That's the answer? Like, how do we contextualize that in a way that doesn't make people who are listening and myself also feel like, wait a second, like, that feels like forcing our hand in a very kind of almost, I don't know if I'm right, but almost like a Christian sense, like the things that we push back against with proselytizing. Are we trying to proselytize our own people? And is that really in line with like the pattern and the rules?
Yeah. So first of all, I'm talking about macro. Micro is a different story. Like two people in a car and it has a head-on collision. One is instantly killed and one survives. This no one knows unless there's a prophet. We don't have any prophets that I know of today. At least none that are openly saying they are, because they can communicate, and the big guy upstairs can say in the big picture of who you are and your soul and the immortality of the soul and reward and punishment, this is why this happened to you. So that I don't know. I'm just saying the big picture is what, that does everyone have to come to the land of Israel? No. Can some people hang out and hide? Yes, of course. I'm just talking about the big themes that we're seeing.
Right.
We never force people to be, the Baal Tshuva movement is a byproduct of people who were disconnected from Judaism, seeing the beauty and the value of it, how it enhances their life. It's never about a fear factor kind of thing. And by the way, I'm definitely not saying this because a person looks religious and maybe keeps kosher and Shabbat. That doesn't make you necessarily a good person. I always say, I know some people who are not traditionally observant, but are really righteous human beings. I know some people who look very observant and dress very observant, but are not really righteous people. So it's not so much that we can't focus on, what does this mean for me now? I'm just looking at the bigger picture of what the patterns seem to show us over and over again. We could test over and over again. The fact that, like the greatest explosions of anti-Semitism come from places where it's the places where we're always suffering from low-level anti-Semitism. It's like the fault line that gets to blow off friction. It's the fault lines that are quiet for too long, like, they don't have an earthquake for 100 years. When the tension is finally released, like stretching a rubber band out all the way, smack, you get this. And this is unique to us, but we become used to it. Sure, we're going to get expelled from here and here and here and here and here. We'll get bounced from place to place until we come back to the land of Israel. So that's like there's a great interplay between, a negative phenomena, which everything, by the way, even the most negative things have silver linings. And that keeps
Yeah.
us from, that's kind of the message I see as a historian who's the rabbi historian, that God's telling us, my children, you need to come home. This is the place for you, and this is the place where you can fulfill. There's one thing we can't do, Ellie, and collectively, again, individual Jews can always opt out. They can deny their heritage. They can marry out. But God says collectively, you are all you're like cells, and like Abraham's like cells, so to speak, in the body. Your mission is too critical. The world, if you disappear and the world loses connection with me, people are going to eat each other alive. I did not make this world for that purpose. And you
Right.
chose the responsibility. You signed a contract. The one thing we can't do on a collective level, because for everyone Jewish, there are literally hundreds of people with Jewish ancestry who are not identifiable as Jews today because they've opted out from one way or another. But the one thing we cannot do collectively, and this is a huge rule that we see, is opt out of the game and say, no, we're tired of this. That's what, by the way, I'm a huge Zionist, but the secular Zionism, we just want a state so we can escape anti-Semitism. And we want to, as it says in Hatikva, liyotam chovshi ba'artzenu, to be a free people in our land. All the early Zionist writers were saying, what is anti-Semitism, which is seemingly the most inescapable phenomenon in the world, as what, whatever. There's Michael Curtis, who's professor emeritus at Rutgers University. He said, anything and everything is a reason to hate the Jew. Whatever you hate the Jew is that.
Right.
Like, what?
Right.
Even
Right. They're too rich, they're too poor, they're too big, they're too
we're
small, they're too
poor,
powerful, they're too weak,
yeah,
they're too
everyone's
capitalist, they're too communist. You just go through the list. Yeah. Rabbi Sachs outlines it really and
exactly.
brilliantly as well.
Say they're jealous of us. Don't trust me. I know my Jewish history. Poor Jews are hated just as much, if not more, than rich Jews.
Right.
But so even that has a silver lining, because even when Jews trying to disappear, it's the heaviest message getting that we can't disappear. Again, individual Jews have disappeared. A lot of Jews have died in the process, and it's been a very painful process. The silver lining was the worst Jewish experience of the last 1,000 years, which is the Holocaust, is that we got a Jewish state out of it. It could have happened a very different way. It's counterfactual historical speculation. There's a series of books called What If? And it goes to events in history. I love it. Like, what if Alexander the Great, in his great campaign against the Persians in the 4th century BCE, had been killed at his first battle against the Persian armies at Granicus? All of human history would have been different. The Greeks would have never come to the Middle East. What if, the South had won the Battle of Gettysburg? Then there would have been 2 countries in America today. What if the Japanese had American aircraft carrier fleet at the Battle of Midway? So there's any number of, it's kind of like alternative universe scenarios, like that movie Sliding Doors, which is a great movie with Gwyneth Paltrow, where she makes the train, she misses the train. It's such a great movie to illustrate this point. And in the end, she meets the guy she's destined to meet, but the journey she takes in the middle is totally different. And you could see that's exactly how it works. So I'm saying the good, the bad, it's all part of the big picture. How it plays out for us on a personal level, but we got to be sure on a personal level, we're doing what we can do. What does that mean? Like I said, you can't represent the Jewish people till you know what the Jewish people represents.
Right. Are you walking your path that you're supposed to be on? And as a Jew, it somehow has a connection to being Jewish.
Right. The only thing worse than being persecuted or, God forbid, dying as a Jew is not understanding what being Jewish is and why you're dying for it. When you understand what we represent and what the struggle of anti-Semitism is ultimately the struggle, and you see this in the world more than any other conflict today, it's like this is so supernatural that Israel's involved in the most unambiguously clear war between good and evil since World War II. Yet a huge percentage of the world seems confused about it and is actually trying to undermine Israel, which is in the front line of the battle. That people like Macron in France are calling for an arms embargo on Israel. Is mind-blowing.
Iran, not on Hezbollah or Lebanon, not on anything else, not on the Houthis. Like it's phenomenal. Actually, it's been really interesting. I've heard this now from more than a few people, which is it feels like the Pharaoh story where God hardens Pharaoh's heart is being played out like that. It feels like the world is having their hearts hardened. And it's a very weird thing to watch from the other side where your heart is being broken and not hardened.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. People's hearts are being hardened. Like we're fighting people who in their charters call Hezbollah exists for one purpose. Since Lebanon has no territorial claims on Israel. Now there's Israeli soldiers back in there for the first time since 2000 because of what Hezbollah has done in violation of UN Security Council Resolution 1701. But they exist to destroy the Jewish state. Hamas, in its charter, calls for the destruction not of the state of Israel, but they quote the Hadith that the day of redemption will not come until a tree in Iraq will say, "Oh, a Muslim or servant of Allah, there is a Jew hiding behind me, come and kill him." Come on. I mean, Hitler wasn't that open about it. The Nazis tried to hide what they did. And here these people are like, they're broadcasting it to the world, yet there are people who are thinking that we are the oppressors. It's just like, it's mind blowing. But I'm saying that, if you understand, it's such a game changer on an individual level when you understand the plot, you understand our role in the story, you understand that all the ridiculous accusations of kidnapping Christian babies, using their blood to bake matzah, poisoning wells, being in league with the devil, controlling seismic, activity and solar flares, triggers tsunamis in Southeast Asia to drown Indonesia with tidal waves, release sharks into the Red Sea to destroy Egyptian tourism, send vultures to spy on Saudi Arabia. We have a space laser. Come on, give me a break.
Right.
We recognize that what ultimately drives anti-Semitism, which as a negative phenomenon is completely supernatural and totally contradicts the prediction of our survival, the most irrationally deep, intense, universal hatred on the planet Earth. Yet we've outlasted all the people that tried to kill us. But when we recognize that all those ridiculous excuses, aside, including the ones that Israel is committing a genocide, that word has been gutted of its meaning now, as is apartheid, because it's been so misused. All excuses aside, whether from 2,000 years ago or 2 days ago, that the one and only true cause of all anti-Semitism goes back to the original point I was making, that we have been trying to schlep the world, often kicking and screaming, towards a vision of values and a world based on the idea of one God and one absolute standard of morality, and that is ultimately the pushback. That's what's really driving it. And very few people say the quiet part out loud, by the way. Hitler did. Hitler says the quiet. He says the Jews put two scars on humanity, conscience on the soul and circumcision on the body. They're both Jewish inventions. The Hitler Youth song said it openly. All the German kids singing in 1933 to 1945. We are the joyous Hitler Youth. We don't need any Christian virtue. Our leader is our savior. The Pope and rabbi shall be gone. We want to be pagans once again. So to go through the Holocaust with that understanding that we have responsibility that we cannot opt out of. I'm not saying it's easy for me to say having not gone through it, but it's a game changer to know where we fit into the story and understand that there is a plot and we have a contractual agreement that great grandpa Abraham signed that on an individual level we can try and opt out of, but collectively we cannot. It's like Nietzsche, the great German philosopher, said, a human being can survive anyhow as long as he has the proper why. And for Jews, that means we can go through anything. Bring on Hamas, bring on Hezbollah. Look at what all the soldiers, I'm so inspiring. I was watching the videos of Golani about to go into battle, saying Shema, and it's wild to watch. There's a kind of a grassroots appreciation of, okay, so a lot of people cry, Allahu Akbar. The other guys are always screaming Allahu Akbar, as Jonathan Sachs says, not in God's name. A lot of people do things in God's name. They're not in God's name.
Right.
But to see that in Israel today is so awe-inspiring and so uplifting to see all these soldiers. About half of them aren't even religious, who are finally connected. Okay, you could say no atheists in the foxhole, but recognizing that we're not only fighting to defend our country because the front lines are 3 miles away from my house. And as Golda Meir said, the Arabs can lose 1,000 wars. We can't lose one. What's at stake is our very survival.
Right.
But to also appreciate that this is a battle between good and evil. And you could see it's reaching its climax. That's another thing speaking of patterns, in the Ezekiel and Zechariah talk about this war of Gog and Magog, because part of this historical scenario as we approach the end of the story, and it's talked about what's going to happen, that the Jews look at the words of the prophets, Ezekiel, Zechariah, Isaiah, Jeremiah, they all start out with warnings and stuff that doesn't have to happen. Bad prophecy is a warning, good prophecy is guaranteed. But the scenario with the biggest brushstrokes, just like look at the big vision of the forest, is Jews physically come back to Israel and reestablish a state. They spiritually come back to their homeland. The nations of the world line up to prevent that from happening because the consequences of us getting our act together in our homeland are absolutely monumental for the end game of human history. They will make, just like the baboon, cornered by the lion, will make its last desperate attempt to fight for its life and its most dangerous. So too, the greatest threats to the Jewish people are going to happen now. And that's exactly what you see. All the things you see, like this, I wrote this book, Destiny, and it's how Tiny Nation plays such a big role. Because I noticed that the plot of all the Hollywood epics, Lord of the Rings, The Matrix, Harry Potter, Star Wars, it's all the same story. Little superhero, big bad guy. Little superhero doesn't even know he's the superhero. He does, the world has gone into a state of darkness and decline. The little superhero doesn't want the job, but his role in history is too critical. He can't escape it. He's thrown into a series of confrontations with a big bad guy, Saruman or Voldemort or Darth Vader, that according to all the rules, he should have lost 100 times over. Mm-hmm. He always manages to survive, sometimes barely. All of his strengths come out. And in the end, there's a final showdown between like Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader, whatever it is, the final showdown. And evil is destroyed and good is reestablished. And the reason why the story beats and the hero's journey is always the same in all these movies is because that is kind of our subconscious on a collective spiritual level, recognizing this is the way the story is really working out. And the protagonist in that story is the teeny tiny Jewish people who, despite being 0.2% of the world's population, has been so transformative in terms of its values and ideas. God tells one of the predictions, we will be a light to nations. How do you take a people who's only 0.2% of the world that everyone hates? No one wants to listen to people who are microscopically small, have no power, and are hated by everyone. Yet the entire human world, all of humanity is running, the words of Paul Johnson, the late great historian, the basic moral furniture of the human mind comes from the Jewish people. And Ellie, I'm telling you, put it together, the highs, the lows, it is the craziest history in the world. I just wanted to read you one more. Listen to this is Nikolai Berdyaev, who is the famous a Russian historical philosopher from the early 20th century. He says the survival of the Jews, their resistance to destruction. This is a Soviet historical philosopher. Their endurance under absolutely peculiar conditions and the fateful role played by them in history, all this points to the particular and mysterious foundations of their destiny. Ooh, but it's unbelievable. So we ran through a lot of stuff there, but I'm telling you, to the extent that we can pull out individually and understand that who we are, what our mission is, that we can't fulfill our mission without having that software, that Torah, the guidance system, that's the fuel, the rocket fuel, the guidance system, of the Jewish people. And understand that we are going in the direction, and understand that everything that was promised and all the rules that were put into play have played out over and over again. And everything promised, regardless of how contradictory it is and how it, few in number, exiled and dispersed, yet reestablishing their state, outlasting these empires, changing the world despite the fact that everyone hates us. Everything predicted either has come true or is in the process of coming true. What it shows me, which is why I so love history, is that the hand that wrote the book that gave us all those prophecies is the hand that controls this historical process. And we just have to wake up and pay attention, especially when we're so close to the end. We're at 5785. And Jewish tradition says that the Messianic era is done by the year 6000. That's the whole thing we didn't really get into, the time frame. I think in the very beginning of our whole history series, we talked about this. I think we did a two-part introduction. Go back to part 1 and part 2 at the very beginning of all of this.
Right. Season 1, episodes 1 and 2. Right. What is history and where are we?
Do the math. That means if that's right, and we're at 5,785, that's 215 years max. And there's Jewish sources that say we got a lot less time than that. I don't even need any Jewish sources. I'm not talking about climate change and Greta Thunberg yelling at me that I'm destroying the world. I'm talking about look at the situation in the world. Look at how fast things are turning. Look at how split the world is. Everything is what? And for those of us who have our eyes awake, eyes open and we're awake, it's so obvious. It's amazing how so much of the world just seems to be asleep. But it's scary. It's like a roller coaster ride. Yeah. But it's very exciting. And I personally believe, I'm not a prophet. If I was, I'd be working in Wall Street, but we are the people who are going to see the end of the story. But the point is not to lie back, because we know the director said, we'll definitely make it to the end. But how quickly, how slowly, how painfully, how painlessly, That's up to us. So the big message here is as we enter a new year is we got to be unified as a people. That is so important. We are all like cells in one giant body. We have to be educated because we can't get the job done without know where we're coming from, what we represent. We have to have the rule book, the playbook. We have to be proactive. We can't, it's too long. The Jewish people have passively waited for redemption. It is very clear that God does not want us passively waiting, not hanging out in diaspora, waiting to get an El Al flight to come back after Messiah comes and builds new housing project, but also in Israel, that we have to be proactively reaching out to our fellow Jews to show them the beauty and the power and the mission of who we are, which all Jews, by the way, I believe love. Even the most assimilated Jew is always trying to fix the world, which is why commitment to social justice is the number one point of Jewish identity for non-Orthodox Jews. We're hotwired to want to make a difference. But to make the full court press now, as we're so close to the end of this game, is absolutely critical. So scary, yes, but unbelievable and very empowering to know we're not spinning out of control. Big wheels are turning. We saw in the last few weeks some incredible things happen that were miracles that may have been hidden, but in a certain way, because no, suspension of laws of nature, but they're miraculous nonetheless. And I don't think it's ever been more obvious in Jewish history than it is now.
Amazing. I think it's such a difficult thing to hold, but it also is so helpful because then it allows us to say, okay, like if we can just get on board with some of those very clear pieces, right? Like, unity doesn't mean we all have to agree, but can we all at least turn our attention and our love towards fellow Jews and the Jewish people and Israel, even if you don't agree with everything it does? Like, can we find a unified direction to point, which would just be such a powerful thing if all of the Jewish people were at least looking in the same direction. I think that would just be incredible. So I love this. I think, as I said, it's really hard to recognize history when you're in it, but in the way that you're describing it, it makes it a little bit more visceral to realize the time that we're in and the responsibility that comes with it. And to start to think about for this year, how, what do I want my part to be and how would I like to play that out?
Exactly. Yep. I say being Jewish might not be comfortable, but it's always meaningful.
Right.
Thank God.
Right. It's not easy, but it's worth it. Yeah, 100%.
Exactly.
Amazing. Okay. Thank you so much, Rabbi Ken Spiro. Thank you everyone for joining us on this first episode of, I guess, season 4. If you have comments, please go ahead on Spotify. We can read your comments. If you'd like to get in touch with us, all of the information is in the liner notes. If you'd like to watch this conversation rather than just listen to it, you can go ahead and find Ken Spiro's YouTube channel. And you can find out any more information about us and what we do. And we would love to hear your suggestions, your feedback, topic ideas, any of those things. Please get in touch anytime. A couple of things to mention. We do have a course starting with Rabbi Spiro at the end of October. And Rabbi Ken Spiro is going to be in North America in November of this year doing speaking engagements all over North America. If you want to bring him to your town or to your city, or if you want to bring both of us to do a live recording of the podcast, that would be a great opportunity to do that, which would be super fun too. So lots of different ideas and different ways to keep remembering what's next. Thank you so much, Rabbi Ken Spiro. Be safe, and we will hopefully see you next week.
Absolutely. Should have good news for the Jews and the
Amen.
world.
Amen. Amen. Thanks, everyone.